I'm Sarah Ruth Alexander, and I am the reading advocate host for Follow the Reader, which is a Spiderweb Salon book club, and it is an ongoing discussion group, and we typically meet the last Thursday of the month. Friends near and far are welcome to join the literary adventure, regardless if you finish the book. We are not judgy. You've just got to be cool with spoilers. Each month, we'll have a book to read together, accompanied by an optional supplemental text for the most ambitious readers. And titles will be announced at least 2 months in advance. We'd love for you to read with us. What you're seeing now is a super special Follow the Reader that is produced in collaboration with Darko Media Lab. All right. And our guest today is Dr. Jennifer Koshatka Seman, who I know from her time in Denton playing in bands, as we're both musicians. Jenny is a multifaceted artist, writer, and actress with an extensive career in anime. You can look her up on IMDb and see all those credits. Give her a Google. And she's currently a history professor at Metropolitan State University in Denver, and also a section professor for the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History MA program. She received her PhD from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas in 2015, and is here to promote her book Borderlands Curanderos, The Worlds of Santa Teresa Urrea and Don Pedrito Jaramillo. Jenny! Yay! Jenny, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, Lindsay Connect. If you've just arrived, say hi in the comments. Suzanne, Steven, let us know you're here. Send us some heart emojis. Hey, Suzanne. All right. Let's talk about, how do we know each other, Jenny? We know each other from, being in bands. That's initially how we know each other.
Yes, we met in Denton, Texas. And so I know there's a lot of folks from Denton, Texas there today. And we played music and we love reading and we work together. So
Yes.
Yeah, a long and storied past. We love together.
Yes. Well, you used to be my boss too, so.
That's right.
And we're still friends.
We're still friends.
All right. Can you give us some oh, hey, if you've read the book, give us a shout out in the comments. I've read the book, thoroughly enjoyed it, learned a lot. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah.
We got Connor Wallace, yay. Oh, hey, this would be a good time to post a link to the book, which was published by the University of Texas Press. Let's put that link in the description below. Yeah. Let the people know where to get it. Oh, and look at this beaut. Yeah. Jenny.
Yes.
Can you give us some a broad stroke of what this book is about?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to. So I thought I might read a little bit from the introduction and then kind of extrapolate, because I'm content to talk a lot about these things. So
Yes.
so I'm going to read the passages that I think give the major sort of overview and the arguments that I'm making. And just FYI, Sarah, that what was happening again. So I don't know if maybe Frank knows, but I'll just roll with it. So for the audience out there, I'm hearing myself after I speak. It's trippy. But Yes. So the broad overview of my book. So I write about two. The echo's gone now. So thank you, Frank. Um,
Yay.
Two curanderos. And so before I read this excerpt, this is from page 3 from the introduction, just to give a basic definition of what curanderos or curanderas are. I'm sure many out there are familiar, but if you're like me, when I first started approaching this topic, I had no idea, which was one of the things that was really interesting for me to research and learn about. But it's basically a kind of faith healing, Mexican faith healing, but also other Latin American countries engage in this healing practice that's really a blend of indigenous, various indigenous healing modalities, some folk Catholicism, as well as African healing traditions. So it's really this syncretic healing practice that varies and changes kind of based on who's practicing at what time and where they are. So just a little bit of a definition there. Okay, so a little bit of reading from my book. These curanderos, Teresa Urrea and Pedro Jaramillo, crossed the border from Mexico into the United States during the late 19th century and practiced curanderismo in borderlands communities from the South Texas Rio Grande Valley to El Paso and San Francisco. Through their practice of Mexican faith healing, they provided culturally resonant healing and spiritual sustenance to ethnic Mexicans, indigenous peoples, Tejanos, and others in the borderlands who faced increasingly oppressive, exclusionary, and sometimes violent forms of state power deployed by both nations, both Mexico and the United States. The two healers attained popularity and fame for their curanderismo during their lives, and their adherents unofficially beautified them as living saints or folk saints, they're sometimes called. As curanderos and folk saints, unsanctioned by the Catholic Church, Santa Teresa and Don Pedrito provided, in the words of one scholar, Frank Graziano, quote, extraordinary creative responses to deprivation and the failure of institutions. And I love that quote. I'll just read a little bit more here.
Yes.
A little more specificity, if that's okay. No, I don't want to bore people. Page 4. It was their extraordinary responses to the failure of institutions that made Santa Teresa and Don Pedrito threats, and in some cases, assets to state and institutional authority. Don Pedrito practiced his curanderismo on the far eastern Texas-Mexico border in the Rio Grande Valley, where he healed and fed drought-stricken Tejanos at a time when the state and modern medicine could not meet their needs. Santa Teresa healed Mexican peasants, as well as Yaquis, Mayos, and other indigenous people, while she spoke of a Mexico in which people did not have to obey unjust laws or confess their sins to Catholic priests. For this, she was expelled from Mexico by President Porfirio Diaz in 1890. Don Pedrito was investigated by the American Medical Association and the US Federal Post Office for fraudulent practices in 1899. Yet he was also used by state authorities to redistribute resources during a drought. So Borderlands Curanderos, this book, examines how in the US-Mexico borderlands at the turn of the century, these two popular curanderos practiced a kind of medicine that did not come from above, did not come from the state, the institutionalized church, or professional medicine, but from below, from curanderismo, a distinct cultural practice that revitalizes sick bodies, minds, and spirits. Their biographies provide a compelling jumping-off place to examine what Mexican-American curanderismo achieved not only in individual bodies, but in the social body as well. And I just, so that very last line that I read, that one of the things that I really wanted to look at was how their healing practice was understood by individual communities and individual people, but also broadly what it did in communities, in the social body. And one of the manuscript reviewers for this book, anonymous, so I don't know who they were, actually made a comment that made that point really clear to me and kind of crystallized that's what I'm really what I'm inspired by and what I really wanted, what I'm exploring in this book is intimate healing practices, both kind of one-on-one, but also what that means for communities, especially sort of marginalized communities in the Borderlands. So that's kind of my broad overview of what I'm doing in the book and what I'm arguing.
Yeah, I found it really fascinating that they often were more successful than traditional medicine, which wasn't that progressed at the time. The traditional doctor situation that often the people would choose to go to the curandero instead and have a better outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's one of those things that coming from, well, there's actually quite a few sort of resonances, I think, now that we can even see some people still make those choices. But I think we definitely live in a world where we accept professional medicine as the standard. That's
Mm-hmm.
those are the accredited professionals, and that's where you go when you're sick. And so, but in this turn of the century period, like the late 1800s, early 1900s, medicine was just beginning to formally professionalize. The AMA, I think, was founded in around 1848. It might be a few years after that, but that's the American Medical Association, which is the premier medical association for physicians. And they were really trying to establish their authority over healing. And part of how they did that was to try to ferret out people that were practicing what they felt was illegitimate medicine. And certainly there were fraudulent healers, and there were people that exploited people's desire to heal. But there were also other healers that, practiced viable medicinal practices that did heal bodies, or at least gave you just as much a chance for certain illnesses as professional medicine might have.
Yeah. And just also how rural and hard to get to someone to heal an ailment also. It was pioneering terrain.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I know, Sarah, growing up in a rural area, in West Texas, but so kind of knowing that landscape, even though obviously a different time period, but the region that I focus on with these two healers they were rural, both rural northern Mexico. In the case of Santa Teresa, she grew up in Sonora and Sinaloa, Mexico, and then left across the border, and then Don Pedrito in the South Texas Rio Grande Valley. These are rural areas, ranching areas, where you had your traveling physician, and so in the case of Don Pedrito, the closest doctor was in San Antonio. For some people, and that would be like hours and hours by carriage or horse to see a professional physician in many cases. So those local healers were really, really important to them, the communities.
Frank, let's see number 23, that photo. Don Pedrito. Yeah, and you can see the slightly broken nose.
Yes.
Which is the origin of his Don, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So, yes, Sarah, you thank you for reading my book and and paying attention. So in the practice of curanderismo, one of the kind of beliefs that's held by people that are curanderos, curanderas, and that believe in it is that the healer has received something called a don. In Spanish, that's like a gift. Sort of like a special gift from God or a special kind of dispensation, a blessing to heal. And so for Don Pedrito, his story of how he got this gift was that he was still in Mexico before he'd crossed the border. And he was working as, a rancher, I think a sheep herder is how the story goes. And he ran into a branch of a tree and it knocked him off his horse. Broke his nose, and he falls by the side of a pond in the mud and loses consciousness or falls asleep. And during that time period, that kind of liminal state is when he's visited by God, according to the story, who tells him you have this gift of healing, and so you must go and heal people, and doing it through me. And so part of the dawn experience and sort of idea that goes with that is that once you've been given that gift freely, then you heal for free. So there's a kind of, for a lot of curanderos, a system of reciprocity, like, I'll heal you, I won't accept any money, but perhaps you might gift me with something. So that this is kind of typically the economic way that it happened. And Don Pedrito especially is kind of famous in his community and still today, among those that remember him and go to his shrine there in Los Olmos, that he helped the community in ways beyond healing them. So when there was a drought, so one of the stories that I trace in the book is there's this drought that happens and the state doesn't have, the will or the networks or whatever to get relief to this rural region. But everyone knows about Don Pedrito, the healer on Los Olmos Ranch. So they use him as a place to disperse of state aid, corn and beans and things like that, because he's already been doing that. He's already, when people come to be healed by him, he'll also feed them, and just kind of, healing the social body. So that's, and as well as bodies that come in. But his dawn is, that broken nose is the sign that this is the kind of healer he is, this special healer. And when you're healed by Don Pedrito, or Teresa Urrea also had a dawn experience as well. The believers, their adherents, believe that they're being healed not just by Don Pedrito or Teresa Urrea, but by a higher power. So for many Catholic adherents, that would likely be God, right? Or the Virgin. Right. But that's the kind of faith healing part of curanderismo.
Yeah, and I also found it really refreshing to hear this story of how he treated people. People would travel a long way, and then they would be greeted with a meal and some coffee, some water, and that's something that's missing from traditional medicine. It's more, as I understand, I mean, if it was like that back then, I don't think traditional doctors greeted you with a meal per se.
Yeah, and this is the other piece of this healing that's just, it's different than the very formalized medicine that we're used to, and not to like critique physicians that are practicing today, because they have a whole set of things they have to do. And so it's, but I think there is something appealing about a healer who has the time and to take care of those needs at first. But yeah, so Sarah, you're maybe referring to one of the stories that I love, but there's so many stories that I found where people talk about how they would come to see him because often they would have an ailment that they maybe tried to go to a professional physician and they couldn't heal them, or they simply felt more comfortable going to Don Pedrito. But often that there is that story where they come to him because it's sort of a last resort. And so, but the stories often, they make the journey to Don Pedrito, and once they get there, he maybe kind of assesses them, but he says sort of like, go over there in the shade, have some coffee, have some beans, right, and tortillas, and rest for a while, drink some water. Like water was a huge part of his healing. He healed with very easy to find things, water, coffee, tequila. He'd often prescribe cheap tequila, knowing his clients. But I think that just that act of relaxing and knowing that someone cares for you, some of the other research I did into the way that faith healing works, I read like some anthropologists and other kinds of scholars about what's going on when someone is healed. They feel miraculously, or through someone like Don Pedrito. And one of the things I learned was that there's studies that have been done that show when someone believes, they're going to heal. They really believe that. And whether that's a professional physician, Don Pedrito, or the shrine, or going to a shrine, that things start to happen in your body and your mind, that healing actually can start to happen. There's been studies that have been done, but you see this in the stories with Don Pedrito, that often there's this story that they began to feel better. Once I saw him, I began to feel better. Once I got closer to Los Olmos Ranch, was this little ranch that he lived on and healed people. So yeah, that taking care of just your physical needs. What's going on? You just need to rest for a while. Yeah, I love that. I love that as well.
And then with Santa Teresa, if we could see number 18. Like with her, the electricity from her hands. And
Yeah.
that also just the warmth and healing of just touch.
Yes. Yes, Sarah. What was interesting about studying these two healers, even though the book is separated, the two chapters on Santa Teresa Urrea and then two chapters on Don Pedrito, there are it's fun to sort of think about the similarities and the differences because they lived at the same time. They both were known as curanderos and healers. But their practices were different. So Don Pedrito, again, was known. People would come to his ranch and he would assess them. Sometimes he would, as we just said, they could sit down and have some coffee and water, some food. And then he'd typically very quickly diagnose them. That was sort of what he was known for. He could do it rapidly. And then he'd write a receta, a little prescription. And it would have like a recipe for maybe go home, take a bath in cold water every 3 hours or something, or collect these flowers that you're going to see when you go back to your ranch and boil them in water and make a poultice, or sort of simple, easy to follow recetas or recipes to heal. And then Santa Teresa, as you're saying, Sarah, she was really known for her hands and a kind of more visceral healing, this power that comes from her hands. Definitely in the Christian faith, whether that's Catholic or other kinds of Christianity, the idea of laying on of hands to heal and pray for someone is common. But this idea that, and laying on of hands, a kind of power is being transmitted through those hands. And so for her, and the image that you showed, I don't know if we could go back to that image maybe, just because it's a great image to talk about the different ways people understand her healing. Yeah. So in this image, you'll see she has a very simple kind of black outfit on, and her hair's back, done very modestly. And if you're able to look closely at it, or you can kind of tell maybe from here that someone has layered in these sort of Catholic or religious symbols on top of her, angels and cherubs, and these things that you would recognize. But the picture itself was taken from a period where she was studied by espiritistas, which are spiritists. Espiritista is the Spanish way of saying a spiritist. And this is a group of people who believe that some gifted people can channel spirits of the dead to get messages from them, or to heal. And they believed that some people were gifted healing mediums, they would call them. And they believed that Santa Teresa or Teresa Urrea was one of these. So Spiritistas were sort of obsessed with her hands, not as these religious, and laying on of hands in a religious way, which her adherents that called her a santa, a folk saint, or a curandera believed her hands were the power of God, or the Virgin Mary was coming through them. But the Espiritista group, this kind of esoteric religion that was very popular in Mexico among the elites, they thought that what was happening with her, and in their analysis, was that electricity was coming from her hands, which was a sign that she was channeling other spirits, and so there's speculation onto who those spirits were she was channeling, but their understanding of her power was that it was through this kind of spirit channeling, and it was the electricity and the kind of energy or prickliness that people feel through her hands. But it was her hands that were the focus, whether it was laying on hands, or whether it was this kind of energy that she would use to transmit healing. But yeah, I love this image because you see both of those identities, both the Espiritista medium, adorned very almost severely, right, with her hair back and the dress, and then someone put on these other things pasted on top of it, to show her as this Catholic santa, or this folk saint that many believed she was, and still in some places do believe.
And I also found it interesting how she traversed the world in a way that women weren't at that time. And she didn't marry until way later in life, which was
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, Sarah. No, and I know, and so Sarah and I know one of the things that our relationship, of course, we're women, but we are interested in gender, and women's sort of place in the world, and that's definitely something. Well, for both Don Pedrito and Santa Teresa, I did some gender analysis, but she's really exceptional, in the sense that she was young, and she got all of this attention as a young woman for this healing, and she to go, and I will get to you that what Sarah's talking about, this part of her life where she leaves home and performs her healing on stages. But even before that, she was really stepping outside of what was expected for a woman in the 19th century. I mean, especially a Mexican woman coming from a very, very stern patriarchal society. Not that it wasn't the same way in the United States, it was, but really this expectation for a young woman, you had two choices. You either got married and had children, or you get these to a nunnery to protect your purity. And so here's this woman who is, and you stay at home. Either you are in the domestic sphere at home, right? You're behind the scenes, you're taking care of the children, or you're in the convent, but you are certainly not out front healing people publicly, as she was doing in Mexico, and in Cabora, on the ranch that she lived with her father, and becoming this kind of public figure. So in some ways it's like, okay, well, women are also, the part of the gender convention is women, it's okay if they're healers. Okay, well, maybe that's okay. They do that, right? But when she started to speak out politically, when she started to have this voice, this radical political voice, and critique the government of Porfirio Diaz, which in Mexico in this period, very, very sort of authoritarian regime, and just didn't tolerate any resistance at all. And so here's this young woman attracting this attention because she's got this healing gift, and she's telling the people that she's healing, you don't have to confess your sins to a priest. And that's heresy in a Catholic nation. I mean, that's, so she's saying, but she's not, she's a, she, I think, as many Espiritistas would, and many sort of Catholics, people that might culturally identify as Catholic in Mexico, but be against the Catholic Church as an institution. She was very critical of the Church as an institution. But here she is speaking out against the Church. She's speaking out against the government, who at this time are trying to take the land of the indigenous people in the region that she's from to colonize it with Anglos and others. So I talk about, that's the part of one of the chapters. So she speaks out in against the government, and they kick her out of Mexico for this. And then when she's in the United States, she lives for a while with her father in El Paso, and then in Arizona. And then at age, I think 23 it is, she leaves home, a woman on her own, traveling through cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles. She goes through St. Louis, to New York City for a while, has 2 children with her lover, her translator, as she speaks Spanish. So, and then finally comes back, eventually comes back to live with her family in the Borderlands. But these things that we might like read this today and go, that's awesome, but yeah, but it's really quite exceptional what she did. And Luis Urrea, so some of the readers out there may know of a major and amazing novelist, Luis Urrea, who wrote 2 novelized versions of her life, but he did a ton of research into her life, and also shared that research with me too. He's a really wonderful person, but he kind of goes into some detail about that in the novel Queen of America, about that period of her life. But she didn't fit the conventions of her time and place. She definitely stepped outside of all of those conventions as a woman, as a young woman, and as a woman of color, a Mexican woman in the United States.
But then also, she wasn't faking anything. I mean, it speaks to her power as a healer, but also she wasn't ashamed that she couldn't heal everyone.
Right.
And I
Yes,
found that
Sarah.
really interesting too. Yeah.
Yes, and there's a like one of the things I got so excited about when I was doing research, and doing research for this book, because neither Santa Teresa or Don Pedrito wrote that much. And really, for Santa Teresa, she had some radical writings in a newspaper that she was a co-editor of, and she was quoted in articles. But there's not like her memoirs or her letters, or as a historian, you're always trying to find that cache of sources where you'll get all the things that you want to find out about. You want to hear her voice, but it was hard, and that was the challenge in this case. I really had to dig for, where do I find their voice, as much as as much as you can find it. So there's this interview where she's taught. It's in St. Louis, and it's when she's on her way from I think San Francisco to New York City. The idea, she's going to do this healing tour. And I see this comment about, yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. So she stops and has this interview, and in this one particular interview, she really talks about what her healing is like. Like, the interviewer asks her, and quotes her, and this is to me, it's one of my things that was most kind of inspiring to me. But she talks about how, this is what I heal. I take people's hands, and I don't think I have one of these images, but in the book I have a couple of images, like press shots of her. She takes their hands and she kind of holds by their thumbs, her patients, and then the idea is she concentrates to heal, and people can feel the electricity or the healing vibrations. And she describes how, sometimes I can do this, sometimes it happens, and that healing is received, but other times it's not, and that energy kind of comes back to me. And so it's just like, when that happens, I can't do everything. So it's not like she was this, that she made these claims that I can heal everyone, come into my, whatever world, and out. No, it was this give and take. And one of the healers that I've met, an amazing woman, amazing curandera, and I don't know if she's here tonight or not, but Dania Lopez, and she's a scholar. But when I interviewed her a couple of years ago, she described a similar thing to me, of how she can kind of feel that when there's openness, and when healing can happen, and then when sometimes that's not there. But yeah, Don Pedrito too, he said, I quote, there's a funny quote from him where, he says, sometimes, my cures work. And of course, these people are so well known because they so often did give cures that were successful, and the word traveled, but sometimes it didn't happen. And he says, like, hey, what can I do? He's quoted as saying something like, I'm not God, I can't heal everybody. So there's a humility there as well. I think that's part of the Don experience.
And Courtney Marie had just commented about the women Santa Teresa kept near her, that also there was this community of women and they helped each other. It wasn't that she was able to get out of bad situations just completely on her own. They banded together.
Yes, and that is one place I know. Sarah and we talked about how, like, would there be things that, if I could, that I had to leave out of the book, or it also got me thinking of the things that I would like to research even more. And one of them is that story. So so Courtney, I love that story. And again, this is one of those things. There's this amazing historian, some folks might be familiar with, Gerda Lerner. And I'm sure I have some of her books back here, but one of the things that she'd write about women in history, women doing history, and what women see when they're looking at the archives and looking at sources. You see, you always want to see yourself, or, we're all, and so, but one of the things she writes about in her research, and she was in the 1970s and 1980s, really, really foundational to like women's studies. And she'd write about stories of women helping women. She began to notice these kinds of stories, and that when I saw that, there was a series of articles in, I think this was San Francisco, and there was a series of articles that I was doing my research, that Santa Teresa sues her manager, and they kind of followed it in the news. It was like a story for a while. And then I blew them all up, I printed them out, and I tried to hunt down these women. So these 3 women advocated for her. One was a spiritualist, so probably, moving in the circles that Santa Teresa was. As far as I can tell by the names of these women, they're white, but again, I don't, that's not always an indicator. But they're helping her to bring a case to a judge to get her out of this contract that she'd gotten into with this manager, this guy who apparently she signed a contract that she would heal people in this office. So there's this office space. She's healing from 9 to 5, and the case is something like she's kept virtually as a slave. And then he's also trying to get her up on stage and promote her, which she does do. She performs her healing in a couple of venues in San Francisco. But it's with the help of these women that support her, and they get the case thrown out. And it's right after this that she goes on her tour by herself with, at first, a female translator friend that helps her linguistically. And later she'll have a translator that is the man that she has 2 children with. But yes, Courtney, Marie, and Sarah, and ladies, and seeing women helping women too, for me, I think is really important, because I know, Sarah, that's, our relationship and but there's also this kind of notion that women are competing, always competing, right? Competing for what little prizes there are. So we just have to compete with one another. And you see that in these kind of horrible shows, the housewives of whatever, that I know about. I've seen like memes, but more broadly, there's an idea that women in history too are either kind of on their own and exceptional, right? And some, or they're with a man, right? Abigail Adams, but women helping women. So I would love to find out more. If I hadn't, when doing research, you sometimes have to go, okay, I think this is what I have here. And my advisor, Neil Foley from SMU, was really helpful for me in going, okay, when do you kind of have enough to make the arguments you want to make in this chapter? But I have so many notes, like I would love to explore that more. So I love that. Thank you for that question.
Did we put the link, Frank, to buy the book from University of Texas Press in the comment section? Is that there?
Not yet. Not in this one, no.
Okay.
But it will be at the end of the stream.
Okay. At the end of the stream. Okay. Gotcha. Are there some questions from our audience? Because I have a question. So, my question, and I had talked to you about this, I warned you I was going to ask about the difference between spiritist and spiritualist.
Yes, great question, Sarah. And and Sarah had texted me some questions, and I love that question. And I actually, I don't know if I think I told you I had like a dream about it, like, that I was giving a paper explaining it. I was like, obviously, on a basic level, they're very similar. So spiritism, spiritism, and then spiritualism. So the distinction, at least for the time period that I'm looking at and the worlds I'm looking at, so spiritualism, so both of them come from, I think, France, Europe, and from Mesmer. So there was in the early 19th, late 18th century, this scientist, physician who came up with this theory of mesmerism. So we use that word now, like mesmerized, but the idea, it was almost like hypnosis. So it was kind of this spiritual science. That's, I think, a key word with spiritualism and spiritism. It's scientific spirit, thinking of spiritual things or of supernatural things that happen, but there's some kind of science behind it. So Mesmer kind of argued that, and he had a lot of followers. It was really popular that you could sort of heal someone through this practice. And there was this idea of there's magnets could be used, and some people could access power magnetism. There's all kinds of things. If you Google this, you'll see people in bathtubs with magnets. It's just, but also the idea of vibrations. But so it spreads out a little bit. And other people kind of pick up that idea and blend it with other things. And one of the kind of followers of Mesmer in the 1840s comes to the United States, and he starts preaching about spiritualism, and he gets a real audience in upstate New York, where the Second Great Awakening has happened. It's a little bit of, as you can tell, I teach history, so but there's so the Second Great Awakening was this revivalist period in the United States of Christianity, and of kind of and a lot of it was based on this very personal experience, and so it could be you could have these experiences, and you could have you could maybe speak in tongues or have convulsions, but it was immediate, was the idea. And so spiritualism is also a practice, although different, where you feel something in your body. You come together around famously the seance table, and and then or some people are known as spirit mediums, like the famous Rochester knockings, the sisters in that story, some people may have heard of. But the idea is that some people, it's a way to connect with those that have died, and hear from them. And also, in some cases, maybe to be healers. Spiritualism, as I've researched it, is more about getting messages from the dead. And especially in the 1840s, 1848 is when the whole Rochester knockings happened. This was also the period of the women's, the Declaration of the Rights, the sentiments, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's famous Declaration for Women's Rights. It was also a high point of abolitionism. And so people like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Quakers were spiritualists. But they practiced it not as I think we think today as, oh, this is fun. Like, I remember growing up and having sleepovers, and we do, those things like light as a feather, stiff as a board, and, for fun, for kicks.
Yeah.
But these people seriously believed that if they came together to access this power, that people from the past, ancestors from the past, would speak to them and give them solutions to problems that were happening. There's a couple really great books about that. So that's spiritualism in the United States. And then in Mexico, spiritism, very similar, this idea that you access the dead, you have some connection with the dead, and they give you messages. And especially in groups of people, they get together in what they call circles, or spiritista circles. So in Mexico, and around the time of Santa Teresa, there were lots of elite groups that were experimenting in spiritism, and a lot of these groups were critical of the government at this time. And so Santa Teresa came from a family that was critical of that government in Mexico, that Porfirio Diaz government. So there was a political bent as well. And so I think really, Sarah, and this is again, my research went just around this time period for the most part. I think it's just a matter of its differences in regions and aspects of spirit, of the magnetism and the spiritism that came from Europe, how it kind of translated into these different cultural contexts. So in Mexico, it was really elites. And we got to see this very handsome man. The spirits that want.
Speaking of spirits.
Yes.
Suzanne has a question. Given that there were so few professional doctors in these areas, what were the AMA's solutions if they had ended up shutting the faith healers down? Okay,
thank you for that. Thank you, Suzanne. Suzanne, right? So the idea was that that Texas, so that the American Medical Association was like, and is the parent professional medical association, but every state also, or most states, in this period, many states were beginning to form their own. So there was the TMA, the Texas Medical Association. And so the AMA kind of relied on the state or the regional medical associations to kind of carry out the sort of their prescriptions or their directives, which are, again, ferret out these faith healers. They would call them fraudulent healers, people that weren't accredited. Accreditation with a professional medical association wasn't needed to practice medicine, but they wanted it to get that way. So I think the idea was, and one of the things that I write about a little bit, Suzanne, is that there was competition between healers. So I think the idea was, if we can get these people to stop going to curanderos, whoever else are going to, more people will come to doctors, and then doctors can be making more money. It was actually really, I think, there's an economic competition. But the other part of this is that many rural doctors could care less. So I think there's one of the chapters I talk about this one doctor that knew Don Pedrito, and he was interviewed, and he said, how do I know if his prayers don't do good more good than my pills? Which really says so much about medicine in this period. There were so many unknowns about healing, and so maybe. So I think in those rural areas, the local knowledge is more important than what the state's going to tell you. With those guys coming in, from the outside are telling you. So I think even with the medical people, a lot of those doctors there had no problem with it, but it was that force kind of from above. And I think the idea was that we'll just get more doctors and we'll eventually eliminate all these other avenues of healing, and then we'll have dominance and people will go to doctors and they'll make more money than they were making in that period. You didn't make a lot of money if you were a physician, especially a physician in a rural area.
Tim has a question. If my doctor thought I might benefit from faith healing, she doesn't really know much about what I believe in. Could medicine learn here, or is this doomed to be reduced into a bunch of mindfulness?
Okay, so let me just make sure I think I understand what you're asking. So by mindfulness, are you kind of talking about like the mind-body connection, that what we're really talking about here in terms of faith healing is that it's about, opening yourself up to another modality, and then that creates a space or creates whatever we might want to call it. So I think, and I'm going to just kind of riff off of your question, but please interrupt me at any moment if I'm off on a tangent. But I think, one of the things about curanderismo today, especially, is that, yes, Suzanne, Dr. Strickland, that's the guy.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it today is that a lot of indigenous healing practices have been appropriated by outsiders, and so in some kind of, I don't want to speak out of turn here, but some New Age healing what we call New Age healing practices, and tend to appropriate indigenous practices, and I think in that way sort of don't get it right. Like they kind of neuter the power. And so I think that there's definitely something that happens. And I think, again, my friend Danielle Lopez, she posted something about plastic curanderas, non-Indigenous or non-Mexican, non-Latina women that do these things. So I think there is a whole world of alternative healing that is very broad. But I think curanderismo and curanderos and curanderas practice something more culturally specific. Not that it's not open for others, but I don't know if I'm at all getting at an answer to your question, though.
But then also some of the things of the time, some of the healing elements of the time, like an electric belt.
Right. Yeah. So there were, right. And so if you look at the kind of, I think I call it, and I'm not the first one to use this term, but the medical marketplace. So there was a marketplace of choices if you were sick. Yes, there was maybe the doctor for some people, or maybe there was the home remedy, or maybe there was, culturally, if you knew, maybe there was Santa Teresa or Don Pedrito, maybe there's a homeopathic healer about, but maybe you're reading through the newspaper, and let me see if I can, I don't think we have an image of this, but I'll see if I can hold it up. Maybe you're reading through the newspaper and you find something crazy looking and scary looking, like, I know it's here somewhere, an electric belt or like an electric helmet. Okay, those. You can kind of see. Yeah. So a little bit you can see, but it's this idea that electricity can heal. So and that electricity is a healer. So also in this period, the turn of the century period, electricity is now really becoming a thing. More and more people have, but still not everybody does, but it's still a kind of newish thing. And the power of there's these new technologies. And so what can this new technology do? Can if I put electrical charges, especially for men, so the electric belt, so here's a little gender analysis, you see these advertisements all over the newspapers of the electric belt for men to gain back their manliness, right? And so this is, of course, code for to bring back vitality. So these are ways to heal, but for women too. You see, women, have you lost your vitality? Have you lost these kinds of things? So it was a way to, I don't even know what that was like, right? To kind of shock something, some kind of energy into your groin area, but they also had them for the head and different parts of the body. I mean, there's so this medical marketplace, or you could write to Dr. Buy for a cure for cancer. You had people peddling a cure-alls, and send me this much money, and I'll send you this cure. This cream does it all. So there were many different choices that a person could think about in terms of being sick, often for things, illnesses that there were no tried and true remedies to yet.
How can the lasting effect of these two be seen today?
Oh, Lindsay, great question. And hi, Lindsay. And I think I saw Gavin have a comment there. Well, in a couple ways. So Lindsay, thinking about healing wise, so I think it really two things, just broadly. Number one, the healing that they practiced in individual bodies still occurs today. There are still curanderas and curanderos that know this practice, that keep this practice alive in their communities and in their households, and sometimes pass it down. So and I think sometimes I share my research with my students where I teach, and occasionally some of my students will share with me my grandmother or my aunt, or I know someone in my family does this. And so it's still viable. Whereas the electric belt is not so much, right? And I think that there's a reason for that, because one of the arguments I really wanted to make when I started out was that this is legitimate healing. Yes, there is an element, when we think of faith healing, often, you get, depending on your belief system and depending on your level of skepticism, you think, well, that's just people that are gullible, or it's the placebo effect, or they're all faking it. And any one of those may be true in any combination. When we think of traditional faith healers, like you come in and a miraculous healing. But what curanderos do, what these two do that I've studied, is a mix of a lot of things. They both knew bodies, they knew herbs. I mean, they both studied, they both, if you look at their recetas or their cures, they had knowledge. And it was really important for me to make that argument, because also there's so much racism in this period of time as there is now. But unfortunately, at this time period, Teresa Urrea. So if you read what some people were writing about her, even in Mexico, a lot of it was gendered, but a lot of it was like about indigenous people. And Teresa Urrea was part indigenous. Her mother was indigenous. Her father was mestizo. But this idea that if you're indigenous, if you're poor, if you're a peasant, right, you're not as civilized. You're not as smart. You're just going to easily fall for someone telling you what to do. And of course, crossing the border, she had to deal with a different kind of racism, which is, oh, you're Mexican. So or anyone that's Mexican was seen in many places in the United States at the turn of the century, or people of color, as more vulnerable to diseases, or they would be disease spreaders. Something about their
still
biology.
happening today. Still happening today.
Or also this idea that they don't understand and so that's all. Those are all constructions that do not reflect the reality, obviously. And so I think, to answer like Lindsay's question, we see that these people are still their healing is still happening because it's effective, and it keeps this cultural practice alive, and it's needed. So that's part one. And then the part two, and I think that's Linda Swenson, which might also be John Swenson, who I love. And anyway, the part two is that, what has changed. So if we think about, unfortunately, a lot of these stereotypes and these ideas that have become very dangerous, these racist ideas are very slow to die. But the other thing is when they cross the border, and I talk about in my conclusion about this, it was pretty easy to do that. And I know when I talk with my students about this, and we think about the border today, it's so heavily policed and it's so built up. And if you didn't know the history, you'd think, well, it must have always kind of been that way, right? But it wasn't. It's been a long process to do that. And the time they crossed the border, people crossed back and forth fluidly. And I have this one image. I didn't share it here, but it's an image of the border between Sonora, Mexico, and Arizona. And if you didn't see the line going through it, you'd have doesn't look like a border. And then not that for me, and I use that when I teach to show students the border is a construction. It's not natural. It's not an inevitable thing. But today, and those regions where Don Pedrito crossed the border in South Texas and where Teresa Urrea crossed the border, the Sonoran Desert, those have been two of the most dangerous places for people that are trying to cross the border to cross that often they don't make it for a variety of reasons. And so, and I know that, my research looks at the turn of the century and it's historically based, but I'm very much, very much an advocate for dreamers and for refugee and immigration reform that's so harmful to so many people. And I think like learning about, hey, there's a history to this. It doesn't have to be this way. Why is it this way? And I think their lives also, to answer Lindsay's question, show the change. They show the change in that as well. But also, Lindsay, too, that their stories are still important to those communities that they're from, and that kind of keep that history alive. But thank you for that question. And Linda Swenson, who also might be Linda or John Swenson. And John, if it's you, we work together at Recycled. And I just have to give a shout out to John Swenson, Recycled Books. John Swenson is the person that turned me onto this book, Teresita. And it's about Teresa Urrea. It's an early book written about her. And this is what got me interested in my topic. So yes. So, and I think, John, your question was about Los Olmos, but I missed it.
The water, is it holy water?
Oh, okay, great question. And some people believe that. In fact, Sarah, I had a one of these things last week with a community in South Texas that are very familiar with Don Pedrito, and some of the folks there believe that there must have been something curative in the soil or in the water. So there are. I don't know. Some people believe that there was. I mean, Teresa healed with the dirt when she lived in Mexico with cabora, and she would mix it with her saliva. And so I think it's very likely that there were curative properties in minerals. And here's my cousin, Ben Klinish. So Ben, have any of these practices been reevaluated through the lens of modern medicine and proven to be effective? So a great question. And Ben, so I think not particularly like these specific cures that the people that I study from the past make, but there have been studies done by anthropologists and medical anthropologists, and so there's a couple books about that, where people have done these studies, like how much is placebo, what's going on in the brain in terms of faith healing. So there are studies that demonstrate that there is some power to belief. And I think it's very much, from what I've read, it depends on the person's willingness to believe it in some cases. In terms of modern medicine, I mean, I think I also have to make the point here that a lot of what we have as modern medicine is based on the plants and the roots, and in the pharmacy we have today, the pharmacopoeia is often based on indigenous things that have been synthesized. So I think when we saying modern medicine, it kind of can seem like, well, that's this thing that exists outside of any of these other things, right? All these other things. Shamanism or indigenous herbal-based healing, earth-based healing is this, and modern medicine is different. I think there's actually quite a lot of overlap if you've traced how certain drugs and certain healing modalities have come to be. But that's a great question, Ben. And there are people that are interested in like, hey, is it effective? And certainly that's a question that I get when I've done talks is like, well, I mean, according to the adherents of these people, they were amazingly effective, and as a historian, my analysis is really more about like, what did people believe at that time and the historical context of that. But there's just too many accounts that they were successful to, I think, and I think because again, their practice was so rooted in the places that they were and rooted in their knowledge of bodies and other ways of healing, that I believe there was validity to it. But today, people still go to curanderas and curanderos to be treated for a variety of things.
Do we have another question?
Thanks for the questions, and thanks for coming. We can't see people, but we can see your questions. So
yes. Can we talk just touch upon the process and what inspired you to focus on these two in particular?
Yeah. So well, it started, I went to graduate school. So I did my undergrad at the University of North Texas, in Denton, Texas. And then I went to Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, and their PhD program, that I got accepted to, focuses on this history of the southwestern United States and the border region. So I went into that program, Sarah, so excited that I was accepted, number one, and I was going to continue my study of history, but I really didn't have a specific idea of what my eventual dissertation, which of course this book was based on my dissertation research and revised, but based on that. And so I kind of was an open book, if you will, when I went into graduate school. A little shout out to books and follow the reader. So I had some ideas, and I worked at Recycled Books, as I mentioned earlier, and often in the basement there in the history section. I still miss it. And with John Swenson and other people. And, one day John pointed out this book to me called Teresita, which is one of the names Teresa Urrea was called, by William Curry Holden. And he is a historian, or he's passed away, and maybe an archaeologist as well. I'm not sure of his exact place, but he worked at Texas Tech University, and he studied the region of Mexico that she's from. And he kind of was one of the first sort of people outside of Mexico to really write about her. And so this is, I think, 1970s was when this was produced. And so John was just like, John, I think you'd be interested in this. We know each other. And so it started there. Really, I read it. I was fascinated. I didn't know anything about curanderas. I didn't know anything about curanderismo. I had never heard about her, but her life is so fascinating. So I talked to, at that point in graduate school, my advisor was a man named David Weber. David Weber is a real eminent historian of the Southwest, and he's since passed away. But he had a conversation with me, and he's like, so what are you thinking about in research, and what are you interested in? And I'm like, a lot of my colleagues had really great research ideas they were already working on. And so I always felt like, oh God, I don't know. And so I mentioned, I'm reading this book. It's really interesting. It's called Teresita. He's like, oh, well, you should do, for his class, he's like, why don't you do a research paper on her, just like a historiography, or like, literature review, just see what's out there, see what's been written about her. And that's how it started, just finding out, reading about her. And then from there, so I at first was focused on Santa Teresa Urrea. And then as I began to read more and learn more about curanderismo, I found out about Don Pedrito Jaramillo, who much, much, much less is written about. There's a dissertation. I mean, there's some things written about him, but not the kind of more in-depth treatments her life had, more or less. So I decided to and with lots and lots of advisors, I mean, I was able to give some conference papers. And when you do that in academia, sometimes you get really great feedback from people that are like, they'll share ideas with you, or people that knew, community members would share things. And so it just kind of grew into this sort of dual look at the border. And then, with my professors at SMU, Alexis McCrossan and Krista DeLuzio, Sherry Smith, amazing women, and then and Neil Foley. They helped me kind of craft, okay, what is the argument? So you have these really interesting lives. They are fascinating, but of course, scholarship has to have an argument. It has to, right, move the conversation somehow forward in the scholarship. And so that's where kind of came out, really started to situate them in their time and place, and particularly with the policies of these institutions. And also I look at the policies of both the United States and Mexico towards their indigenous populations, which were one of the things that surprised me when I first learned it. Very similar. In this period, both the United States federal government and the Mexican government were dispossessing indigenous peoples of their homelands violently, as happened here, and it happened with the Yaqui in Mexico. So you see the border, doing Borderlands history is so interesting to see what's different. And this, first of all, the border is such an artificial creation, but what's different in this nation and what's the same? And one of the similar things was, again, the kind of treatment of indigenous peoples. And so these kinds of practices, even though they're syncretic and Mexican American, right, but there's still keep alive that kind of those traditions, often place-based traditions. Los Olmos Creek, or the earth. So that was my road. That was my road to the dissertation. And then I was lucky enough to, get a book contract. I put a proposal together, again, with a lot of help from people. This guy over here, my husband, Mike Seaman, and I worked with the University of Texas Press. The editor there, who's now the editor-in-chief, Robert Devins, he's amazing, and he really helped me, after all that, kind of craft it as a book, because a dissertation can be real academic. And so, I mean, the book is too, I think, but try to craft more of a narrative. So it's maybe a little bit more pleasing to read, but still has those arguments and still has the research. So.
Well, now let's get to the portion where we kind of let our hair down.
Woo!
Woo! And get kind of book clubby. So follow the reader. We, at the end of our book club meetings, we draw some word dice and draw 5 and then roll them. And we make a 5-line poem. So the words are balance, flock, melodic, those, on. Yeah.
Okay.
And then if someone feels that their 5-line poem is of public interest, let us know. Share it with us. But also, while we're composing our poems, which I'm not going to, because I'm too busy right now. But I mean, and it would just blow everyone away, and then they'd be so intimidated. Yeah. No, but hey, let's go through some of the photos, Frank, of Jenny performing. So 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yeah. And so this was a Spiderweb Salon event that Jenny performed at some time ago. But there was another time that I saw Jenny at J&J's. It was one of my absolute favorite shows ever. It was Jenny and Ed. How do you say Ed's last name? I'm so bad.
Preisner.
Good gosh. Yeah. And they were performing, and there was this woman there in the audience who we had never seen before. I don't know where she came from, don't know where she went. But she continuously was saying things like, baby girl, make me feel, baby girl. And I loved it. I was in heaven. It was great. It's great show, Jenny.
It's one of those memories that I will never forget, and that we share. And I think we talk about that memory and we relive it together almost every time we talk to each other, and it never gets old because it was fabulous.
It just goes through my head so much. I'm just like, baby girl, make me feel. Come on, baby girl. You know? Just think about that as a mantra, you know?
It is. It is. It's women supporting women. You know what? That's and Sarah, my mom texted me with a question. Is it
All
okay if I
right.
quickly answer
Yes,
that?
absolutely.
So yes, not to interrupt the flow here, but so my mom, Mary Grace Koshatka, hello. She wanted me to explain about Santa Teresa's dawn, and was that
Yes.
okay, was that normal or extraordinary? And mom, that's such a great question. So like we talked about, Don Pedrito had his dawn experience falling off the horse and the nose and everything. So her experience was, so first I'll describe it, mom, and then we'll talk about whether it was normal or extraordinary. And I think it was extraordinary, but so what happened to her is that so she was living, Teresa Urrea was living on this ranch. Her father was a fairly wealthy hacendado, like a big rancher in northern Mexico, in Sinaloa and Sonora. These are the western states in Mexico. Anyway, she was apparently known as a kind of precocious, vivacious, and she was really interested in learning to heal. So there was a curandera working on the ranch, and all ranches would have a curandera. And they would help deliver babies, help deliver animals, do cures, remedios for people. So she loved to, as the story goes, follow her around. So she'd been doing that, and around the age of 17 or 18, she has this experience where she kind of goes into a trance state, and it's really unclear about exactly what caused this. And she kind of went back and forth for several weeks between being sort of in a trance, kind of not there but not there, and then having fits, convulsions, and this is detailed in many of the sources. People describe, that they would have to have four men hold her down. She was convulsing, and then she'd be fine, and then she would be lucid and talk about the visions that she'd had. And at one point, she was quiet for so long and her heart rate had slowed so much that her father thought she was maybe gone, that this was it. They were not sure what was happening. And the idea was that maybe she was going to die, but she doesn't. She has this sort of near-death experience. And when she comes out on the other side of it is when she claims to, and what people believe, she was different. Again, she'd always been someone who liked to heal, so she had been gathering knowledge, but now she had this kind of other ability to really see, where she would describe, I can kind of see where someone's sick before they come to me. And again, like Sarah mentioned earlier, sometimes, not always, but sometimes she can. And she would sometimes pray about certain cures that would come to her. And so this is really when her dawn experience gave her that supernatural gift. And this is really important to know for the community of people. So it's not just that Don Pedrito and Teresa Urrea believe in curanderia, this is a commonly understood kind of person, and a gifted person. So the people in her community believed this of her, and they're the ones that called her Santa, like Saint Teresa. She often said, I don't like that when they call me that. I'm not, but I've accepted it. She says, because they believe it. But so to my mom's question, I think it was extraordinary, but I think that from the other healers I've spoken to, they have described similar, not exactly like that, but situations where there's a moment when they know that they've been gifted, and often it has to do with a personal tragedy, a physical, their end of themselves physically, and that's what something happens. Teresa Urrea may have been, so there's speculation that maybe she was experimenting with plants that were potentially hallucinogenic. Certainly in the South Texas region where Don Pedrito is from, peyote grows in that region. That's mostly where it's harvested. So some talk, you don't really see it in the sources, but there are some people that would say he must have used peyote in his healings, because as a healer, knowing the region, but that would probably be something you wouldn't write about for a lot of reasons. Number one, that was any indigenous practices in this period in the United States were illegal. So, and the American Medical Association. So, to answer my mom's question, I think it was extraordinary the way hers happened, but it wasn't extraordinary in that other healers have had these really intense experiences as well, and then come out on the other side of it with their dawn. So thank you, Mom, for that question. Thanks, Sarah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Does anyone have a poem to share?
You've had a good 5 to 10 minutes. I wish my brain's full right now too. I can't even remember the words. The was one. Those was one.
Oh, balance, flock, melodic, those on. Those on a balance, melodic flock.
See, I love it. Those on a balance.
Often when we do this, I try and read my poem first because there's so many great writers in the group, and my poem is always just so bad. Oof. But also, so follow the reader. Oh, would you consider writing historical fiction based on your research? Oh, that's a great question.
That's a great question. And, I think I mentioned at the beginning of the Follow the Reader, but I don't have the books right here, but Luis Urrea, who is a fiction writer, amazing fiction writer, but he's also written nonfiction, has written 2 fictional or novelizations of Teresa Urrea's life. The first one is called The Hummingbird's Daughter, and it's about her time in Mexico. And then the second one is The Queen of America, and it's about her later period. I know they're here somewhere, and I feel like I saw them earlier. But anyway, they're. But in terms of, Suzanne, okay, here's just a shout out to Luis Urrea because he's really brilliant. Also, someone who has been very gracious to me, supported my work, and he gave me a blurb, which is really, really nice in the back of the book. So, but I love fiction. I love reading fiction, and I've really kind of recommitted, especially after finishing the manuscript, and to reading everything more, to fiction and historical monographs that I want to read. But I think I've learned a little bit on how to sort of construct a narrative. But what's so amazing to me about fiction writers is they know how to tell stories. They have, and so I would love to try it, try my hand on it. I have no idea if I could do it though. The thing about writing this is that I had all this material, and when you do scholarship, you're beholden to what the sources tell you. You interpret them, and it's always a process of selection in terms of what seems to be more important to you or what you want to focus on, whether that's gender or race or those things. Another scholar might have been researching Teresa Urrea, and the whole story about the women helping her may not have caught their eye. It's just a couple of articles in the San Francisco Chronicle and a couple other papers. So I think maybe I have an eye for stories that I am interested in, but how to go to pull that together, I don't know. I'm not sure.
What are you?
Oh, yes. And so John Swenson, another amazing book about a healer, about a curandera that John Swenson gifted to me. Jewel Bab, here it is. And I believe this is from Recycled, Border Healing Woman, and she's from the region near Marfa, that part of Texas, and she herded goats. This is an amazing, whoops, there we go, story, nonfiction about her life. Yeah, John, thank you. I have lots of books.
On those fateful nights, the infirmed followed the melodic sound of quiet, rural noises beckoning them to their only hope, a healer of balance and humility, shepherding their tired, rejected flock. Ah, beautiful. Yes!
Wow, Lindsay.
Got one!
Wow.
Woohoo!
See, this is what writers do. That's amazing.
Oh, we got another. Heal me with something melodic. I can only balance moving. Oh, you can just replace those empty boxes with locks or flocks on the mantle or under the bed. If there's another one, you should read it, Jenny.
Okay,
It's like,
okay.
I like Jenny's voice. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute.
I like your voice. I like the way you say my name.
Oh my gosh. Hey, Courtney Marie. What's on the horizon for you, Jenny? What's going on? What's next? What are you working on?
Well, great question. I mean, now I am. I'm actually thinking about like if there's these things that I would like to explore more that I wasn't able to for this book that I might. I'm trying to carve out some time to look at a couple of things. I mean, one of them is that story of the women helping women, see, what else might be out there. There's also a couple other things that I wanted to find out more about, but again, I kind of had to stop at a certain point. And I do touch on it in one of the chapters, the strike in 1903 in Los Angeles, the Pacific Electric strike. Mexican traqueros or track workers were laying down track for, and I believe Gavin, one of my students from the Gilder Lehrman Institute, is here who wrote about this. But there's this strike and this among the Mexican community in Los Angeles. They weren't getting paid. They were being exploited. And so they were laying down track and they create a union and to strike for higher wages in 1903. And there's these stories that came out in the Los Angeles Times and other newspapers in Los Angeles that Teresa Urrea led a procession of Mexicanas, Mexican women, through downtown Los Angeles, past like the striking, and then into the union, the Mexican Federal Union, and was this kind of figure. And of course, the writer in the newspaper writes about her and the way that she was often written about, like, poor Mexicans follow her. They will do anything she says. That kind of very condescending. So there's that. But when I saw this, and I'm like, what? So she got politically active again. So she was, which totally makes sense. That's, but I would love to look at that more. Also, what's interesting to me about that story, and I just touch on it in the chapter, is they wanted this track to be finished because it was going to be fiesta days in Los Angeles, which was kind of their city boosterism, to just kind of, there was kind of a competition in that period between San Francisco and Los Angeles, of which was the city people would go to. So both cities were kind of competing for that. And President Teddy Roosevelt was going to be in the Fiesta Day parade. So the city was all like, harassing these strikers and writing all kinds of awful things about them in the paper. And so like that whole story to me is really interesting, and how you can have a city that was once, well, it was Spanish. Spanish was indigenous before that, but it was Spanish, it was Mexican, and now they're celebrating that heritage, but at the same time denigrating these Mexican track workers because they're Mexican, but yet celebrating fiesta. And you see the advertisements in the newspaper of buy your sombrero, right? So, and I almost feel like it's this way we have in right now with the Dia de los Muertos celebrated, or Mexican independence, where it's okay to celebrate Mexican culture and appropriate it, right? But at the same time we have these policies that are kind of defining people outside of, you're not really American, really. So I think, I've been toying with the idea of working on something like maybe even just a blog post. I'm not sure. So those are things that have come out of my research. And I'm also in touch with a lot of people from South Texas that know about Don Pedrito, that have continued to share their stories with me. So there's, I think, more, like if there was another edition of this book, I really believe it would be expanded. I would have more that I could put in there. So that's in terms of like what I'm kind of thinking about now. And I don't really have like a completely new research project in mind. I'm still really thinking about a lot of the issues that are central to Borderlands Curanderos, and seeing if there is something more to explore there or not. So yeah,
Awesome. Yeah.
kind of where it's at. Yeah, thank you for that question.
All right. And hearkening back to Follow the Reader, this is our book for March, actually. We read Jenny's book for February. And so, Big Friendship, How We Keep Each Other Close by Aminatu So and Friedman of the podcast Call Your Girlfriend. So, sometimes people talk about how to maintain close friendships. So, it's a good book to read. All right. Just talk to me and Jenny. No.
Yeah. It's true. It's true.
Yeah. And Jenny, you have turned me on to, I think, a lot of great reading. For example, Carson McCullers, which is one of my favorite authors. And maybe also Louise Erdrich.
Oh, it was this book, right? My bookcase over here. The last report on the miracles at Little No Horse.
Yes.
So it has some. It's so great, everyone, and it has some of those similar themes, I think, of healers. And there's a priest, and there's a saint, and there's miracles, and it's so great. And have you read, Sarah, this one, The Roundhouse?
Not yet.
Okay. It's been on. I'm going to send you a copy of it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really, 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 really good.
All right. Well,
yeah.
In conclusion, any last bits of knowledge, and send us out with something inspirational. I didn't warn you.
Okay. So something. Let me open up. Let me open up to you. I actually was given this challenge by a blog. I'm not sure this person's blog. I should remember the name of it, but he listed my book, which was really nice. And then he asked me, he's like, do you want to do this page 99 challenge? Where, I don't know if you've heard of this, where you go to page 99 and it's not William Carlos Williams, some famous writer had this thing, like, if you're go to page 99 in a book, and there you'll find like the core of the book, or like the essential something of the book. So I'm working on actually doing just a short thing about what's on your page 99, and does the page 99 challenge work? If a reader opened up to page 99, would they get the sense of what your book is about? So on page 99 in my book, which kind of goes along with some of the things that we're talking about, obviously, there's this section called "The Journey is the Part of the Cure," and it's in the Don Pedrito section, and it's the section where I'm talking about, or kind of reviewing various people that came to him for healing, their stories and what happened, and kind of analyzing those. So there's this one guy, Prisciliano Martinez, who comes to Don Pedrito because he had taken a serious blow to the head. He'd been hit while working as an overseer for a large ranch where he was in charge of a group of men carrying posts to make fences, ranching area. Martinez explained that his men were resentful of him because of his position. He was employed as a middleman between the Anglo ranch owner and the Mexican laborers. They beat him very badly, especially with punches to the head. He felt depression as well as fright and anger, all the symptoms of susto, or soul loss. I'll just pause for a second. Susto is something I write about. It's a specific illness that curanderos heal, where it's something it's like a trauma, or something that shakes you. Something that happens that it's not just physical, but it's more than that. There's an idea that your soul is lost in this moment when this trauma happens, and it needs to be brought back. You need to be brought back to yourself. So Prisciliano Martinez perhaps had a susto. So he felt these symptoms not only because of the physical harm, but also because of the emotional wound and feelings of shame at being abused by other men who were taking out their frustrations on him. Don Pedrito looked at Martinez and told him nothing was wrong, and he should simply take a bath in lukewarm water when he got home. According to the prevailing gender ideology at this time, this simple cure might have revived the heat in his body as well as his sense of manhood, sort of like the electric belt was supposed to do in these advertisements. Don Pedrito also provided what a therapist or a priest would, a familiar, comforting, and authoritative presence that eased his anxiety and affirmed that everything would be fine. Martinez remembered that he began to feel better on his way to Don Pedrito, perhaps anticipating the healing to come, and claimed that, quote, he became completely well after he saw him and performed the cure. So,
all right, yeah.
There you go. The way that healing maybe works, and healing something that, again, is one of these illnesses that is not so clearly defined, but a susto, a soul loss. I don't know if that's inspirational or not.
Yeah. No, it's great. Like page 99 challenge, success. All right. Well, thank you so much, Jenny. This has been great, really awesome. And also, special thank you to Darko Media Lab for producing this. This has been great. This is the first time I've worn a dress in I don't even know how long. So, yeah. And oh gosh, I could go on about you forever. Like every picture I see of you, like so photogenic. I don't understand. It's magic.
Oh shucks. I feel like my head's so big. This is my paranoia with Zoom. I'm like, oh my God, my head's so huge.
Oh dear.
So thank you, Sarah. This has been a really great a chance to talk to Sarah is always the best, and to talk about. Thank you for Spiderweb. Thank you for Follow the Reader, for like making my book a part of it. That's really, really, really nice. I'm really honored to be a part of this, and I love y'all in Denton, Texas. Miss you, and can't wait to get my vaccine and get down there and see everybody and hug and do all those things.
Yes, UT Press, University of Texas Press. Get it? Get it? Awesome. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.